The quill halted mid-air when Commander Shen shoved the wooden restraint against Zhen's ribs and ordered him to speak. Guilt tightened my throat before I could swallow. I felt the guilt as a weight in my left hand where the quill rested. It shaped every motion after that. Speak, Commander Shen. Zhen gasped a name, names tore loose, and I copied each syllable without pause. I write this from the same narrow shelf where I have slept these last months. I am Lai Wei. I keep records for the prison archives. I copy confessions, index them, and seal them away. Tonight is not different in place. It is different in what the ink does. In the alley below the archive, a cart squeaked at 11. In the candlelight, my fingers began to stick. The table smelled of tallow and damp paper. The first page was a ragged thing, a confession half, broken and full of sputtered admissions. I held the quill with my usual ritual, tapped twice, steadied dip, and the liquid in the inkstone held a dark sheen that did not skim like ordinary sumi. My fingertips left marks that refused to rub out. I worked as I always do because Commander Shen's presence makes refusal more dangerous than copying badly. Li Wei, Commander Shen, not a question, and I set the line neatly. He checked the letters as if they were armor. Make it legible. His voice was low, Australian iron in tone. I felt his weight behind the words. Make it legible for the magistrates. Make it legible for the seals that will condemn. Zhen convulsed between the sentences. He tore air and named a merchant and an alley and a girl who would never appear again. I wrote the exact words he made. At the moment his voice broke, a guard handed me a strip of leather soaked with dark streaks. I did not look away. The second sensation was discovery. When Zhen doubled over, I watched the leather and then the inkstone with the precision of a man trained to note detail. The ink clotted at the rim of the stone. It smelled metallic in the candlelight. When I dabbed a fingertip to blot a blot on the page, the tack left a smear that did not dry neatly. It pulled at the paper fibers and clung. I felt something cold through the quill handle run along my palm. Commander Shen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The ink. He did not wait. Do your work. Lai Wei. He slid the leather back to the guard and leaned down to Zhen. He lifted the man's chin with the rim of a gloved finger and asked, "Who sent you?" Zhen spat a word I had not expected. Q. He it between breaths. Q took the silver. Q. Write it exactly. Shen's hand tapped the table twice. I wrote, Q, with the exact stroke order my master taught me since boyhood. I kept my eyes on the letters. Telling myself to concentrate on penmanship is a habit that has saved me punishment a dozen times. After the guard hauled Zhen back by the rope, I felt the ache between my shoulder blades. Commander Shen turned to the ledger rack and spoke as if speaking to the room rather than to me. These confessions prove loyalty. The magistrate will like this. He folded his hands, his face creased into its permanent sternness. Seal it. Present it. The household keeps order when records are honest. When the candle guttered, I moved to the small alcove where I clean and mix pigments. I have mixed ink since I apprenticed. I know the proportions for lampblack and glue, the tiny touch of water that makes the strokes sing. This liquid did not behave. It stuck in strings at the quill's nib. It gathered into a thick bead that trembled but did not roll. I set my finger to the bead and drew it across the stone. It cooled as it spread and left a metallic scent against my skin that smelled like wet iron. Doubt followed the discovery. I held the stone to the candle and watched the drop quiver. The thought entered my head like a coin dropped into water. What if it is not ink? My jaw tightened. I tested with a scrap. The mark soaked into the paper, and a dark ring widened as if the page drank the stain. I wiped my fingertip against my robe. The threadbare sleeve took the smear and would not clean easily. A guard's boot scuffed the threshold. Commander Shen's shadow filled the alcove doorway. He did not smile. Li Wei, he said, this time softer but with the same iron. We finish tonight. Prepare the signed page. He reached into his belt and produced a small lockbox and a tasseled cord. The magistrate expects names. The order was a wall. I had options that men with less to lose might take: refuse and be beaten, flee and be hunted, deny and be charged with dereliction. Each choice handed pain to others: my mother who keeps our water jar by the kitchen door, my sister who cooks the thin porridge. The guilt I felt in the room was not only mine. It spread to them in my mind like a stain. I moved because I had moved 1,000 times before. I took a fresh sheet, tapped the quill twice, and dipped. The liquid held the same cold gleam. My hand shook once. Commander Shen watched the motion, eyes narrowed. Liwei, Shen, sign your name. I tried to stall. Commander, the man will not. Shen interrupted. Sign. He pushed the quill into my palm with a hard finger. The quill bit into my skin. I tasted copper in the back of my mouth, not from blood, but the memory of it. When I pressed the nib to the page, the liquid rose like a small tide. My name began to form under the slow scrape of tip and paper. The letters were mine. The stroke that loops on the second character trembled. The ink did not feather. It sank with a gloss that caught the candle and made the line look like a fresh bruise. I heard Zhen's moan from the corridor where the guards had dragged him. I heard a distant wheel outside, the city noise that usually rings like a separate life. My palm left a smear on the paper, and the smear held color. I signed. The ink glowed a wet red, darker where my hand pressed harder. The signature was an act, a seal that said I agreed to these words. Emotion shifted then. Guilt turned to dread. The dread was not abstract. It struck as a cold burn up my forearm where the smeared black had touched skin. I thought of the tainted strip of leather and the way the paper drank the mark. I thought of my mother's hands, calloused and clean. I thought of ways to hide what I had done. I set the sheet on the table and waited. Commander Shen catalogued the page aloud. Confession, signed by Lai Wei, Merchant Q named. Sealed for the magistrate. He paused, then said, we will send men to Q's stall in the morning. I wrapped the sheet with routine motions. My fingers trembled as they folded. I slid it into my satchel under the worn cloth where my family talisman slept. The talisman warmed against the folded page like something that would not be comfortable near it. I stood very still while Shen wrote notes in his ledger, the small bone-handled ruler tapping his knuckles with each count. When the guards removed Zen, one of them shoved him roughly. I heard the man's pleading voice crack into a broken sentence. Zen called for his mother. He, Liwei, and then coughed and could not finish. I wanted to answer, but my throat stayed shut. I had written his plea down and signed it. The ledger would read differently when the magistrate knelt over it. In the narrow corridor outside, the candlelight bent. I pressed my back to the cool plaster and opened my satchel. The folded page caught my eye. I slid it back out and opened it again beneath the single guttering candle in the corridor. The drop at the corner of a paragraph widened and seeped into the fiber until the characters blurred. In one place a tear of dark spread like a pupil forming in paper. I touched that dark circle. The residue came away on my finger and left a faint tack. I could feel the tack between my skin and the linen. My nails scraped the smear and left a thin white crescent that the mark tried to reclaim by sinking deeper into the fibers. I turned the paper so the candle glowed through the sheet and watched the dark bloom. Dread shifted to a sharp, precise fear, fear that had a name and a set of actions attached. If the ink contains blood, then each signature is a witness. If the paper holds blood, the paper carries the trace. If I carry the page, I carry the mark. The fear made my hands small and efficient. I wiped the smear on the inside of my robe and then licked my thumb and rubbed. Saliva and cloth took off little. I wrapped the page back and placed the talisman over the fold as if a mother could hide a wound with cloth. I did not sleep. I opened the ledger in my small room and took out a clean sheet. I put the talisman beside my shoulder and began to write. Not the kind of copying I usually do, but a record in my own hand. I wrote the time, the names, and the smell of the ink. I wrote small sentences. Ink clots, smells of iron. Paper drinks. I tied the page with string and slipped it beneath the floorboard where my father once hid a note about taxes. The action made me feel purposeful rather than helpless. A small knock came at the outer door while I was still binding the secret page. It was a slow, measured knock, 3 strokes. I froze. The knock was not the usual bark of a guard. I listened. Footsteps paused in the corridor. I held my breath. The knock came again, softer. Something inside me clenched so tight I nearly dropped the quill. I slid the stolen confession into my satchel and replaced the satchel on its peg. I opened the door a sliver. A young guard peered in, eyes quick, voice low. "Li Wei, Commander wants you back. There is another man in the next cell. He will not speak. Shen says we need your hand, he my name like a rope pulling." I closed the door and locked it. I had minutes to decide. Minutes where the ledger I had made lay beneath the board, like a planted seed. Minutes where the talisman warmed against the page in my satchel. The guard's words moved me into motion. I went back to the table. The next man in the cell was smaller than Zhen, hair matted, lips cracked. He would not speak at first. Shen stood near with his ring glinting. "This one will tell a name, Shen. If he will not speak, we will make him." He looked at me and the look did not ask. The man's teeth chattered when he finally made a sound. He spat a place and a single name. "Master Wu." I wrote the syllables with careful strokes. Shen's hand rested on the back of a guard's shoulder. He did not touch the subject. He read the letters over my shoulder and then told the guard to fetch the restraint. 3 times in that hour I thought I could refuse. 3 times I almost did not sign. Each time Shen tightened his jaw. Once he named my sister and said her occupation, and that the household owed no leniency to those who obstruct justice. The information was precise, mechanical. It was a way of measuring the cost. I signed the next page and pressed my wet line down until the ink settled. The chapter's peak came when Shen pushed the quill into my hand again and said, "This is your mark." On it I dragged the nib and watched my name sink into the letter. The ink pooled at the final stroke, and a bead fell onto the margin. I did not flinch when the bead struck the paper. I could not. I closed my eyes only for a heartbeat, and then opened them to the smear that had reached the talisman's outline. After Shen left to arrange the morning's arrests, I hid 2 pages. One I left in the official packet to be delivered. The other I wrapped and slid beneath the floorboard with my ledger. I slid the talisman between them. I forced the motion that made concealment an action rather than an escape. When the door clicked behind the last guard, I sat at the table and counted my hands. My hands were stained. I ran water from the basin and scrubbed with ash until the skin grew red and tight. The stain dimmed but remained in the ridges of my fingerprints. I held the fingers to the candle and watched the light, the small scars and the ink. I thought of Zhen's mouth forming his mother's name and stopped myself from saying it aloud. I was the one who had made the word permanent. Later, under the single guttering candle in my sleeping shelf, I opened the page I had hidden and watched the dark spot bloom again, as if testing the fibers. I put my palm on the page to feel if the warmth of my skin would change the stain. It did not. The blot remained as if set. I closed the ledger and wrote 1 line in the margin. "Do not let the magistrate read the second signature." Then I folded the ledger and pressed it under the floorboard beside the secret page. I tucked my father a scrap of paper on top and hammered the board back into place with the small mallet my father used for repairing shoes. I performed those motions to anchor the hiding in physical labor. A new sound rose from the corridor, footsteps with another pace, deliberate and heavy. They paused at the stairs. The last beat of this chapter is not a thought but an arrival. Someone knocks with a single, solid strike. I slide the satchel to my cot, wrap the talisman around my finger, and wait with the door unlatched. This chapter ends with that knock. It is a knock that will force a choice I can no longer avoid. And the page beneath the floorboard will be the evidence or the accusation depending on how I move next. Commander Shen shoved the sealed jar onto the writing table and said, "Mix it now." The command hit the wood the way a stone hits water. Full stop rings, then sinking silence. Guilt sat under my tongue like a stone. Guilt that has guided my hand since the first time the quill froze in my fingers when he shoved the wooden restraint against Zhen's ribs. I glanced at the quill to steady it, tasting iron on my lips, then reached for the inkstone because a scribe does not argue in front of torturers. Outside the alcove, the corridor breathed with muffled footsteps and the scrape of leather. Commander Shen stood over the collapsed prisoner, his coat dark against the candlelight. He set the jar down so the lid scraped the table. The jar seal was tight, wax jagged at one edge. "Do it now, Lai Wei," he said. His voice was low, methodical. There was no room in it for denial. The stakes were clear in the first sentence of his order. A confession must be produced tonight, and it must be written in a way that could not be undone. I had thought the weight on my chest after the first interrogation would loosen with repetition. It did not. Guilt shifted into fear as the jar's shadow cut across my hands. I had recorded names before, names spit through cracked mouths and names pressed into paper by my own nib, but never had I been told the pigment must include blood. "Commander Shen," I said, my voice measured, "the ink will stain everything. The pages will darken faster than usual." I said his name because habit taught me to place his name where people can anchor themselves. He answered by tapping the small lockbox at his belt, the metal ringing like a promise. Shen moved the prisoner closer. They had lashed him into a leaning frame so his chest rose in short, ragged pulls. Zen's eyes were wide and wet. He did not recognize me, or he refused to, or the breath in his throat was only pain mapped into syllables I could not read, right as he speaks. "Commander Shen the men and make sure the ink takes him. Sign it personally when it is finished." The words left no space for negotiation. My hands trembled once and then steadied because work is a muscle and panic shakes until you find a rhythm. The first motion after Shen's order was mechanical. I lifted the inkstone, set the lid aside, and rubbed a small well with damp cloth to prepare the surface. The cloth smelled of soot and the faint burned plant they used to stanch wounds. A torturer dragged the prisoner into the doorway, and Zena's shoulders bumped the lintel. He moaned. The sound scraped against the stone like a dull blade. I felt a shift inside me, doubt pressing at the edges of my obedience, then a colder worry about what would happen if I refused. That was the first emotion shift. From guilt to doubt, and then quickly to fear. "Names now, Commander Shen." He crouched so his face was level with the table and the candle. "Speak plainly. No evasions. I will correct your words until they read the way I need them to read." His fingers rested on the lockbox. The men around him tightened the ropes. One of them, a broad-shouldered man I had seen before, leaned close and spat. "Hurry, scribe. Don't make me break him again." He used my name once. I looked up. The mention anchored me in the room. I dipped the quill. The inkstone took a drop, and the surface darkened with the black fluid they kept for official records. Then a man brought a basin. They cut the prisoner's hand and tilted it so blood dripped into the hollow. A smell of copper crawled across the table. I did not look away. My body moved as if controlled by habit. Dip, hold, make a mark. The quill left a thin line that swallowed itself as the blood thinned the ink. The second emotion shift came then. Fear to numbness to a new, cold resolve to survive. My throat tightened. I controlled the way my fingers tapped the quill twice before each line. The small ritual in my mannerisms meant to pause me, meant to remind me I was still a craftsman. Zena name and the syllable hung in the alcove like a small stone. I wrote it exactly. Commander Shen reached over and altered a word with the tip of his ruler, pressing his fingernail into the paper so the ink spread into a darker splotch that looked like a bruise. "This says conspiracy," he murmured. "Add the phrase with intent to overthrow here." He touched my wrist briefly, guiding my hand. The contact was a command. "Lai Wei," he said, "make it read as if he meant it." I corrected my sentence under his hand with my quill and a line of blood. Thinned ink swallowed the correction. The talisman fell in the middle of the forced recording. I saw it first as a small white slip pressed into the prisoner's torn sleeve when a torturer readied the next strap. It crumpled on the table, a fold of paper sealed with a red stamp. My breath stopped for a full second, the way wind stops before a bell. I knew that mark. My thumb brushed the quill's carved notches as if counting. That small paper bore the same seal pattern as the wooden talisman hidden under my robe. My fingers grew cold. The discovery altered the room's geometry. In the space of a single scrape of the quill, the distance between witness and accused shortened until we shared the same table. "Where did you get that?" Commander Shen Zhen. His voice remained slow and deliberate. He used Zhen's name once and then turned his head to me. "Li Wei," he said, "explain this. If his talisman matches yours, then perhaps the record needs a second signature." The words had a bladed edge, an implication that my family and I could be implicated. I looked at the talisman. The red seal had a crack in its circle. My chest tightened and the third emotion shift pushed through me. From numbness to a sharp, burning shame and then toward a cold calculation. Shame made my hands clench. Calculation guided the choice. I moved without announcing the plan. While the torturers adjusted Zhen's bindings, I wiped the inkstone with the sleeve of my robe, transferring streaks onto my cuff. My movement was small but deliberate. I slid the talisman into my satchel where the wooden inkstone lived, under the worn cloth I used to store quills. The action felt like theft and like preservation at once. I told myself later that I hid it to protect my family. In the room, each small motion was a decision between survival paths. Shen watched me. He watched every hand. He tapped the lockbox and did not smile. "Li Wei," he said, "you will sign the final line." He it as if reciting policy, and as he recited, the torturers tightened the leather straps around Zhen's elbows. The prisoner shrieked when pressure met nerve. The sound made the candle flame shake. Wax dripped on the paper and left a tiny burn scar. Right. I confess under my own hand, Commander Shen's order was novel and precise. He required my physical signature. He wanted the authority of my hand to turn a coerced voice into sanctioned proof. I thought of the quill halting in my left hand the first time he pressed the wood restraint against ribs. The memory was concrete. The grain of the wood, the smell of sweat and soot, a name that stuck to my tongue and would not pass. I felt the quill's shaft like a lever inside my palm, and the memory pushed the muscles the way a river pushes a mill. "I will sign," I said. The words were not a confession of my own guilt. They were an acceptance of role. My voice was steady, but my stomach folded inward. The men positioned the prisoner so his mouth was open and his jaw slack. Blood pooled at the side of his face in a thin, dark line. "Say the phrase exactly," Commander Shen instructed. He leaned close and counted the wording like a liturgy. "Say it so the ink cannot be read as anything else." He held up the lockbox and placed it within reach. I put the quill between my lips out of habit, then set it back into my hand. The ritual of tapping the quill twice became a single, slow hammering in my chest. My hands moved to the paper, and the inkstone's surface glistened with the blood-thinned mixture. They forced the phrasing once, twice. Each time I dipped and wrote, the strokes darkened faster than any usual pigment. The characters bled where the mixture was strongest. Commander Shen corrected my order of words with the bone, handled ruler until the sentence read like law. "Li Wei," he said, "press the quill down with your right thumb. Seal it with your hand." He did not ask. He did not smile. "Sign it." His tone was void of malice and full of requirement. I pressed the quill. The nib sank into the paper and the blood ink pooled, then spread into the grain. When I formed the final character, the tip of the quill slipped and a drop landed on the pad of my right thumb. I felt the wetness and did not flinch. The drop darkened against my skin and soaked into the small white scar by my left eyebrow that I had carried since boyhood. Commander Shen took the ruler and, with a single, precise motion, pressed his iron ring into the margin next to my inked hand, leaving a tiny dent and a smudge that matched the lockbox seal. "This will be authoritative," he said. The room changed after I signed. The torturers bundled the prisoner into a stretcher. Zhen's lips moved in a string of half-sentences and coughing breaths. Commander Shen closed the new roll and wrapped it in a broad strip of waxed cloth. He stamped it with the lockbox seal and set it on top of the others. "Take him away," he ordered. Men carried Zhen past the doorway, and one of them muttered my name as if to place blame. The sound landed on my shoulders. I touched my ink-stained fingertips and felt the jagged print of the wooden quill notches press into my palm. When the corridor cleared, the candle flame shifted to a thinner spot of light. I sat back and tried to find the boundaries of my own body. My hands were stained. The stain had settled under the nails and into the cuticles. I took the talisman from my satchel and held it against the candlelight. The seal's crack matched the wooden talisman I kept hidden at my waist. I pressed the paper between my fingers until it dulled, then folded it into the lining of the satchel. There was another decision to make: conceal the link or smuggle a page. The shame curdled into resolve as I weighed options. Shame became anger toward the system that would use my hand to write people into boxes. I wrapped a single page from the roll in an outer sheet and slid it beneath my robe. The paper took the heat of my body and softened. My breath slowed as I imagined the consequences. If found, my family could be questioned. If hidden, the single page might reveal that I had not only recorded but been forced to author. The third emotion shift resolved into a grim steadiness. Fear into shame, into a deliberate plan to carry evidence. I stuffed the page low and tightened my belt. Later, at a side table away from the main workbench, I leaned my forehead against the wood and counted the small notches on my quill until the room's edges no longer jabbed at my mind. Commander Shen returned alone and placed the sealed roll into his lockbox. He closed the lid with a soft clack that sounded final. "You understand your place, Li Wei?" he asked. He folded his hands and looked at me as if we were merely two officials exchanging a ledger entry. "You will do this again when asked. You will sign." There was no violence in his tone, only the iron of certainty. I nodded once. I did not tell him about the talisman hidden beneath my robe. My nod was the only thing they needed. Outside, the guards resumed their patrol. Inside, the candle burned lower and the pool of blood, ink on the stone wrinkled like dried paint. I ran a thumb along the ink-stained edge of the paper roll I had kept, and felt the slight roughness of dried blood where my signature had been. The thought of that texture arriving at other hands made my stomach turn. In the dim alcove behind stacked scrolls, I had a choice to conceal or expose. I pressed the single page into my inner robe and felt the paper's weight as a physical thing. I also felt the wooden talisman's grain against my thigh where the small charm sat hidden. I took both items and wrapped them in the cloth that carried my father's scent, a faint smoke and the leather smell of old books. I tucked them into the satchel and buried the satchel beneath other, more mundane rolls. My hands did not shake when I finished. The movement was careful, practiced. That carefulness was not calm. It was calculation. Commander Shen placed the sealed roll in his small lockbox and closed it with a key that clicked like a verdict. He slid the box onto his shelf among other boxes, each one holding sealed confessions whose ink had been adjusted by my hand or another scribe's. The box fit like a cipher between weights and old ledgers. He touched the lockbox once and then left. The shelf was high enough that only a ladder could reach it quickly. The lockbox's hairline crack let a tiny sliver of dark show through. My handwriting, my stain, was visible only if one looked closely. I sat alone and counted the moments that led to the final motion. The jar, the talisman falling, the forced phrases, the pressured signature. Each event had its own sound. The jar scrape, the rulerous tap, the blood thud into the basin, the quill's rasp on paper. Each sound registered as proof that I had been present and complicit. I touched the small white scar near my eyebrow and noted that the dried blotch of ink matched the scar's edge. My body registered the closeness of consequences as a tangible pressure across the shoulders. A knock came at the archive door as required in our practice, a late check by a courier or a supply boy, I told myself. The knock was 2 short beats. My throat tightened and I looked toward the corridor. I smoothed my robe with both hands and slid the satchel lower under the table. The knock became a small cliffhanger in the middle of the night. A test of whether I could keep what I had hidden or be forced to reveal it. The sound moved through me like heat. I opened the archive door a crack and a young guard's face peered in. He carried a sealed list of names. "Commander Shen me to confirm delivery of the sealed rolls," he said, glancing past me toward the inner room. He read the label on the nearest box and then paused when his eyes fell on the lockbox. He did not see the tiny crack, but his fingers brushed the shelf as if testing for dust. I took the list without speaking, and his hand touched my sleeve. He my name in passing, and then he left. The exchange added another layer of decision. A guard's casual presence suggested that the lockbox's contents would be moved again soon. I returned to the table and opened the satchel long enough to slip my thumb beneath the folded page. The paper smelled faintly of iron. I smoothed it out and read the single line I had taken. The forced phrase, the signature, the smear that marked me. I did not cry, my lips were dry. My eyes were unmoist. I held the page to the candle and watched the flame highlight the ink's blistered edges. I folded it again and slid it into the seam of the satchel. There was a decision to be made whether to deliver this evidence to someone who might use it or to keep it hidden and hope time eroded its authority. I made a choice then that would bind me. I would keep the page for now. I would hide one piece of truth inside my possession and watch how the system moved. I would not be the one to hand it to Commander Shen. That choice tied me to risk and made me an active bearer of consequence. It was an action that came from the root emotion in the chapter, guilt, but transformed into a plan driven by shame and then a controlled, cold resolve. I fastened the satchel and set it beneath my bench where the dust settled heavier. The lockbox remained on the shelf, and the sealed roll with my handwriting glittered faintly through the hairline crack. Commander Shen's office light went out a few minutes later, leaving his door ajar. I counted the seconds it took for the corridor to empty. The final external event of the chapter arrived as a deliberate sound. The lockbox's click when he closed it in his hand, the precise weight of authority settling onto the shelf and into my life. I rested my hand over my own ink-stained fingertip and pressed the dried drop until it left a tiny crescent of pigment on the cloth. I did not claim absolution. I had altered phrasing under command, and I had pressed my hand into the blood, dark ink that formalized another man's confession. I had hidden a talisman that linked me to the accused, and I had tucked away one page of proof. The immediate conflict of the chapter resolved. The forced confession was completed and sealed, the prisoner taken, and I had made a deliberate choice about concealment. The consequence had been established in concrete terms. Commander Shen now possessed a roll bearing my hand and a lockbox that held it among other stained testimonies. The shelf with the lockbox was the last image before the chapter closed. I slid the satchel beneath the bench, locked the small wooden lid of my inkstone, and put the quill into its notch. The candle guttered once and then steadied. There was no speech of finality, no sweeping reflection. The chapter ends with the concrete sound of metal on wood, a lockbox closing and being placed on the shelf above my head. The noise was a verdict and a promise at once. A sealed roll clung to my fingertip and tore a thin strip of skin as I turned the stack under the low candle. Guilt sat in my throat like a stone. I tasted iron and the candle soot on my tongue and counted the seconds before my hand would stop shaking. The corridor smelled of damp paper and old wax. The seal left a dark smear across the web between my thumb and forefinger. I remembered the quill halting the first night Commander Shen shoved the wooden restraint against Zhen's ribs and ordered him to speak. I remembered the jar sliding across the table when he said, "Mix it now." Those memories were not thoughts. They were events that shaped each movement of my hand and the choices I would make this night. I carried the sealed rolls toward Vault B with the guard's lamp at my shoulder. The lamp's glass fogged where breath met cold. My fingers left the smear on the outermost scroll, and I could see the seal's sheen catch the candle. The central problem was clear. The confessions were bound with a substance that marked flesh and paper alike, and my stained hand tied me to every line written with that mixture. If someone asked why a scribe's hands bore such a mark, the answer would point to the table, to the jar, to Commander Shen's orders. Guilt pushed me forward. Shame narrowed the space of choices I allowed myself. I reached for the iron latch and a guard's voice said, "Lie way." The guard carried the torch low. His boots scuffed the flagstones. I handed him the stack and felt the stain smear further across my palm. He looked, then away. The guard did not speak my name as rebuke. He used it like a ledger entry. I kept walking. Commander Shen stood at the antechamber table when I arrived. He was already lithe in the candlelight, the embroidered insignia dull against the dark robe. He laid his hand on the sealed jar as if testing its weight. He did not look surprised to see my stained fingers. He never did. "Bind the new set, Commander Shen," without looking up. "Bind them with the same seal," I asked, my mouth dry. My voice reached no higher than the fabric of my robe. He tilted his head and watched me. "Do what you are told, Lai Wei." The order held no room for hesitation. I laid the roll on the table and peeled the wax from the jar's mouth. The smell hit, copper and oil and a faint stink of charred paper. I dipped the quill. The dark substance soaked the nib like syrup. My hand hovered above the paper, and I felt memory press against the back of my eyes. The first stroke that froze, Zhen gasping a name, while I could not swallow. Alone at the table later, I tested a single drop onto my palm. The prick of the seal sedge caught the skin when I pressed the roll closed, and a small thread of blood rose where the seal had torn. I smeared it with the quill and felt a metallic sting that moved inside my wrist. My vision blurred at the edges and the candle flame crawled like an insect. Revulsion pushed at me now. The substance tasted of iron, and it made the skin tighten where it touched. My fingers darkened under the skin as if the dye spread inward. I wrote a blank line on an empty strip to watch how the dark spot bled into the fiber. The ink sank, then turned the paper a deeper shade on drying. The letter lines held weight. The paper drank differently than soot or lamp, black. This was not ink meant to bear testimony alone. It changed what it touched. Footsteps in the doorway. They dragged Zhen in with rope at his wrists, head bowed so the bruises around his eyes read like a map of the last interrogation. Commander Shen watched him with the same steady gaze he used on a ledger. Zhen's shoulders shuddered when the light hit him, and then he found focus as if some part of him had been saving it for this moment. "Speak," Commander Shen ordered. Zhen looked at me. His eyes landed on my hand, and the dark smear revealed itself under the lamp. He laughed once, a sound that tore and did not reach his throat. "Lewei Zhen, they bind paper to flesh. They seal it to the living." Shen's jaw tightened. "Explain," he said. Zhen's voice was thin. "The seal remembers who touched it. The confession does not close until the one who wrote it bears the sign." Commander Shen's face changed for a moment. The carefully measured lines in it loosened into something like impatience. He stepped forward. "You speak of sorcery and old wives' tales." Li Wei finished the binding. I held the quill. The emotion inside me shifted from guilt to fear. For a breath I thought the guard at the door might take Zhen away again. But Commander Shen left the ropes in place and watched me as if I were the mechanism he needed to run. I thought of the sealed jar sliding across the table in that other night and how I had obeyed then, and I felt the scale of my choices. Fear tightened my chest. Then a colder calculation replaced it. If the seal left marks only when hands had touched the substance, my stained hand was proof. If proof existed, I could not pretend ignorance. When Zhen spoke again, his words landed like stones. "They tell you the words free you. They tell you paper takes the guilt. But the paper keeps the mark of the living. It keeps their breath when it dries." "Zhen," Commander Shen sharp now. "You want to pull every accusation into the open. You want to embarrass the office." "No," Zhen spat, then coughed. "I want the scribe to know what his hands hold." Silence stretched. I could measure it in the scratch of my quill on the table. The guard shifted. Commander Shen's calm returned with a tighter edge. "Lewei," he said, "bind them in front of us." I placed each roll before me. My hand pressed the seal to the wax and left a smear. I wrote names as I always did. I wrote confessions phrased to satisfy the officers. When I reached a name that I recognized, a neighbor's given name that I had read in a grocery account long ago, my fingers hesitated. The memory of his face in market light came with it. A man who had once given me a smile when I asked directions. That memory was an event, a fact that belonged to the world outside this table. I smudged the line. I slipped a thin correction into the script and folded the strip. When the junior clerk came to pass by my table with a stack of blank sheets, I nudged a roll into his hand and said, "Take this to the back. It needs cataloging." He left his hair wet from sweat and did not look back. I watched him go and felt the first shift in my feelings from fear to something like resolve, small and dangerous. If an altered line could spare a name, I would risk the penalty. The junior clerk, Juan, was a pale youth with a freckle near his nose and hands still soft from homework. He blinked when I handed him the roll and did not ask questions. An external event, a footstep above the stair. A guard's shout from the corridor. Commander Shen walked away and left the jar on the table like proof. The jar sat open, and the smell of iron rose. I had placed the altered roll among others in the stack on the low shelf. My chest constricted. I told myself that the small act mattered. It was not liberation but a fissure. Later, when I returned to the table to fetch the sealed inventory book, Commander Shen stood at the stacks and his fingers brushed the rolls. He took one down by the silk tie and held it to the lamp. He did not hesitate. He looked at my hands and the lamp's flame caught the dark line across my webbed skin. "Le Wei," he said, "explain this stain." My throat closed. The guard on watch at the door stepped forward. "Commander Shen demands a full accounting," he said. I tried to move words past the seal of panic in my mouth. My fingers flexed and the old reflex returned. Tapped the quill twice before explaining. That gesture had been mine since I was an apprentice. It was a ritual that steadied me. The emotion inside me shifted again, from resolve back to dread. As I realized the trace on my hand could not be explained away, and that Huon's name would link him to any roll I had touched. Commander Shen lifted the roll and slit the wax. He did not speak as he unrolled the sheet. He read a line and then another. His gaze ran across the paper until he found the smudged name. He looked up at me without anger now, only a narrowed question. "Why did you change this?" he asked. I put the smallest of denials forward, using humility as a shield. I recognized the name. I thought an error had been made, an error. Commander Shen repeated, "Errors are for clerks, Le Wei. Confessions are not errors." Zhen's voice cut in from where he sat. "You can save a name, scribe," he said. "You can make a roll that will not talk. But the seal speaks with your blood if you give it." There were 3 quick exchanges then. Commander Shen ordering the guard to fetch binding wax. The guard moving. Huon appearing at the doorway as if summoned by the room's hunger. That rapid chain of events forced me to act. I pressed my palm to the table to steady myself, and the dark smear left a faint track on the wood. "Bring him forward, Commander Shen." Huon stand. Huon's hands shook. He did not speak. I wanted to call his name softer, to tell him it would be all right, but I could not make my voice reach him and keep truth inside it. The emotion that had driven me to save a name now turned on me as a second guilt. I had dragged another into the ledger. Commander Shen lifted the small bone-handled ruler and tapped it twice against the table. "Li Wei," he said, "if the seal marks only those who touch it, we will see whose hands bind the confession." He pushed the jar toward me, and then the moment became a cliff. I thought of my mother's talisman folded at the bottom of my satchel, the tiny carved wood she had given me when I left home. I thought of the first time the quill had stopped in my fingers when Zhen gasped a name. The internal voice that had kept me silent in Chapter 1 felt louder now, but that voice was no counsel. It was memory of obedience. The climax arrived when Commander Shen forced my hand to the quill and demanded I prick my finger. He held the quill and pressed it to my flesh, saying, "If you will not confess with paper alone, confess with yourself." My breath went shallow. I heard the guard's boots knock against the stone. Zhen's eyes were fixed on me, and I saw anger there like a sudden flare. Huon stood frozen, his mouth parted. I had 2 movements ahead of me: comply and leave my blood on the roll. Refuse and watch them break me in other ways that would leave me useless for the ledger. The room narrowed into choices. I pulled my hand back at first. The motion was small, but it held the weight of refusal. Commander Shen's jaw tightened and he leaned closer. "Do it," he said. I let the quill press. The pain was mercifully sharp and clean. Blood welled and I wiped it with the corner of my robe to gather a drop. I watched it bead on my skin and then took the quill and let the drop fall onto the nib. It soaked into the wood and the feather. My hand trembled. My fingers were stained. I wrote the sentence as he instructed. My name, the list of transgressions the office required, a short admission that would fit the ledger's demand. The seal that followed was warm and sticky. Commander Shen watched as I set the wax and pressed my palm to the paper to leave the mark. The wax hardened and the print kept my lines. The clerk one shifted, and I saw a question rise in his face that had nothing to do with orders. He had not yet learned the cost of small acts. When the wax cooled, Commander Shen rolled the confession and tied it. He placed the roll on the shelf among others with a deliberate motion and said, "Now the archive has truth and proof." I walked to the vault entrance with my hands stained and the talisman hidden beneath my robe. I slid a folded scrap of paper with Huon's name into a seam in the bundle before the guard could watch. The small act was not justice. It was a record only I would know how to read. The emotion inside me altered again, from the immediate fear and shame to a stripped determination to atone in some marginal, private way. I had given my blood to the archive as proof. I had left a secret witness in the stack as atonement. Dawn arrived as a grey slice along the corridor when I stepped outside. My palm left a dark print on the lintel as I pushed the heavy door. The talisman at my belly was warm from my breath. I did not look back at Vault B. I could not let the sight of the stacks press on a new shame. I walked with deliberate steps and a measured breathing that kept panic at bay. A final event. As I passed the guard post, Zen's voice called out, rough from incarceration. "Le Wei," he said, "remember, paper keeps what you give it." I turned and met his eyes. For one instant I let myself feel everything, the fear, the guilt, the small relief that an altered line might shelter a name. I nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that made no promises. Then I walked on. I placed a talisman inside the nearest roll before the clerk could seal it, the same talisman my mother gave me. It was not a talisman to undo what had been done. It was a private ledger entry, a promise that some part of me would not be lost to the shelves. The archive remained as it was, rows of quiet paper, sealed confessions stacked like a city skeleton. My hand would carry the mark for years. My name would sit inside a piece of wax among the others, and no one would read the slip of paper I tucked with Huon's name without a reason. The chapter closed with a concrete beat. I walked out into the narrow street where peddlers were already opening shutters. A boy near the market hawked morning buns. I watched his hands as he shaped the dough. My guilt did not evaporate. It settled into specific acts. Checking the knots on Huon's wrists, slipping paper into seams, sleeping with the talisman beneath my robe. I kept the ledger in my head and a private list of what I had hidden. At dawn I stopped at the bridge and washed my hand in the cold water. The dark line would not come off. The wash took soot and candle wax, but the stain stayed under skin. It would remain as a record of what I had touched and of the moment Commander Shen forced a confession from my flesh. The archive had its binding. I had mine. I did not believe I had escaped. I believed I had survived in a way that required daily work to keep guilt from growing into something that would break me. The final act in the vault had resolved the immediate accusation. The archive contained my seal and my confession. The officers had their proof. The junior clerk Huon went back to his station with his hands unmarked and his face unreadable. Zen remained bound and alive, and he had spoken a truth that no one outside the room would call by name. I had altered a line and I had paid for it with my blood. When I folded the talisman into the seam of my sleeve, I felt a private weight and a private release. I could not undo the confessions already written. I could not take back the sentences I had penned while I obeyed a table and a jar. But I had put one small object between the rolls, a witness not of law but of choice. The morning sold its light in practical measures. Fish for the cook, oil for the lantern, cellar, wages for the porter. The world moved in tasks and trade while the archive kept sealing names into paper and wax. I walked on with hands that bore the seal and a pocket that kept my talisman. My steps were measured. I felt the change in me not as a speech or a vow but as action. Counting the sealed rolls twice before sliding them into place, making a note in the margin that only I could decipher, catching Huon's eye and giving him a small, coded nod when I could. The ledger remained intact, Commander Shen maintained control, and the archive stacked confessions against the wall of the city. The last sound I carried before the market swallowed my footsteps was Zhen's laugh, a broken and bitter thing that tasted like truth. It did not free him. It did not free me. It changed what I knew I had to do next. Keep a tally, hide a truth, and hold a mark. The archive would hold the city's confessions, and my hand would keep the evidence that I had written what men in power demanded. That was the end of the act. I wiped my hand on my robe one more time, palmed the talisman, and walked into daylight with a ledger in my head and a seal in my flesh.